Yeah, okay. Hi everybody, my name is Vytas Jankauskas. Thanks for having me here, privacy salon. Maybe I can also speak closer, but I don't know if this will be super okay. So yeah, thanks for having me here. It's actually my first time in the Netherlands. It's like the only country that I've never been to in Europe, which is quite cool. I mean, it's obscene at the same time. But so thanks for this little cute occasion for me to be here. Today I'm going to talk about Latent Intimacies, a project that is here at the exhibition. And I'm not really going to talk about the project. Like, I will mention the objects from there, but I kind of wanted to more focus on what is informing or what informed this project. So like different interesting quirky concepts around intimacies that could be sort of seen as like as conceptually valuable, and that kind of either have already shaped the way these objects are or will shape in the future. And also, even though my name is on the exhibition label, this is sort of this is pretty much a collaborative project, so I also wanted to make sure to thank Justin and Valeria, Paulina, Moises, and Yanira, who since the very beginning of this project kind of jumped on board. It was developed as part of Lab 03 residency at Media Lab Matadero in the beginning of 2024, and then kind of evolved since. And especially with Justin, who also sort of walked me through this presentation yesterday, we kind of keep in touch and continuously collaborate to bring this project to various sort of new shapes and concepts. So like, and also Valeria, who I will mention later, who worked a little bit on these new versions of prototypes that are here. And one of the reasons why I don't want to talk about the project itself and kind of want to dissociate a little bit from it is the fact that there are many concepts around intimacy, and some not around intimacy, some around the perception of technology that we have maybe when we talk about intimacy, that have influenced this project. But if I say that they all are this project, then it's kind of underwhelming, because then you go to these little prototypes and you're like, no, okay, it speaks, you know. So I just want to talk about these several notions that are kind of, I find interesting in terms of looking at what intimacy looks like today. And this is just one of the illustrations of possible illustrations of Shoggoth, which is sort of a weird blob-like creature coming from the lore of J.P. Lovecraft, a science fiction writer. And this is particularly from At the Mountains of Madness, which kind of describes it as a terrible, indescribable thing, vaster than any subway train, a shapeless congeries of protoplasmic bubbles, faintly self-luminous, and with myriads of temporary eyes forming and unforming as pustules of greenish light all over the tunnel-filling front that borne down upon us, crashing the frantic penguins and slittering over the glistering floor that is and its kind had swept so evilly free of all litter. So essentially, like, he describes this like shape-shifting blob that takes this gargantuous size, and I will jump to the slide, which we have seen many probably times, or at least some of us have seen, which is called The Anatomy of an AI System, which back in, I don't even remember, like 5 years ago probably, it was done by Kate Crawford and Vladan Joller. And I think this diagram, of which at the top you see this tiny voice assistant described by, taking human interaction. So I think at that time it was Amazon Echo. And then you see all the infrastructure behind it. And I think what is interesting there is that it's kind of like, apart from this sort of demystification of technology, there's also this very interesting moment of mystifying it at the same time. And I want to refer to a book by Nicholas Nova, who was a great friend and who recently passed away just after publishing his last book, which is for now only in French, called The Persistence of the Marvelous, or Persistence of Wonder, where he starts in the Swiss Alps talking with the people who used to engage with different types of lore, such as gnomes and trolls and viruses and so on. And they say that these notions are disappearing because people don't remember them anymore. So Nicholas goes to trace them down in today's technology. And so he attributes, among other things, because of his gargantuesque size, this idea of a massive shoggoth or like a massive monster that the AI has become. And it's a very interesting story where he afterwards goes to like describe these technologies as a sort of decomposing beings that take a lot of data. We don't know where it ends up. These massive infrastructures become these sort of representations of weird metaphors that we create around them. And he says that on one point of view, this sort of, let's say that this sort of metaphor can be seen as yet another tool of obfuscation, so using metaphors to reduce our understanding of technology. But he also says that at the same time, metaphors in the history of humankind kind of worked both as a way to, let's say, present certain technologies in an understandable way, and then also surround them with a certain lore that would make them feel more important, but also present certain cautionary tales. So when I talk about these big technologies, actually one of the reasons why I wanted to evoke this work by Nicholas Nova is that we kind of, when working on these little prototypes that you will see in the exhibition, maybe have seen already, we were focusing on the rather opposite type of metaphor, which is this creature of the Chakmul. Well, it's not really a creature, it's actually a monument for dead soldiers. It's believed to be, like, nobody really knows the origin, but it's this Mesopotamian figure of a man leaning with the ball, which is kind of a little bit reflecting on, I think a few years ago there was this photography project where they were photographing people looking at their screens while they're in their bed. And I think this is a kind of interesting reflection. And the idea of behind this figure, supposedly, as told by researchers, was that these were dead soldiers carrying goods, carrying sort of goods from war to the gods upon their death. And I think this is kind of an interesting way for us to engage with this technology, because this human being is kind of looking at you now, well, a little bit higher than you are now, but is asking for certain answers. He's like, what is this that I'm carrying? And I think for us, this was much about how we approached this project. Rather than seeing as like a shoggoth, as this big monster, we try to reduce the scale of AI systems in order to build intimacies through their inherent properties. And so the first of the objects that we made was called Cats. It's kind of like the most lighthearted way of dealing with AI. You probably have seen different manifestations of similar kinds of projects. There were, I think, Teenage Engineering had built a friend. There was like this AI lover pendant kind of thing. There have been live blogging tools and so on. And so Cats is this prototype that leverages hardware-imposed constraints to resist AI's demand for real-time processing. So we have this little object that contains a very, very pruned large language model tuned to compose haikus based on what it sees. And because of its low processing power, it essentially has to wait anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes to actually process a single query. And so for us, like, this is kind of interesting because it evokes, like, Cats as a prototype, it evokes these rhythms of pet ownership, but also subverts surveillance through its lossy, low-fidelity output. So you will hear it speaking once in a while. It says something in this old-school voice synthesis, like, oh, I saw this, and so on. So for us, what was very interesting was to look at a lot of open-source alternatives to what major language models are today. And for people who do work with AI, you will probably know the platforms, like open source platforms such as Hugging Face, where you actually have now over 1 million models accessible to people. And I think that AI, in a way, has brought democratization of models to like a next level in terms of how many can we access and how many can we appropriate to our use. I'm not saying that all these models are open source, because also open source has become way more complicated since the coming of AI models, because a lot of models don't share their data sets, for example. They only share the code for inference and training. But what's really interesting for me in this concept is that you are in this kind of new sort of paradigm where focusing on one thing, like we as designers used to focus on having Adobe Photoshop, is kind of not the vibe anymore. And this appropriation is, whilst at the same time sort of overwhelming, but it's also very promising in terms of like how we might use AI in the future. So we kind of try to always like scout for better models. We're not also against, even though these objects are completely working offline, we're not necessarily against upgrading them and stuff. So like, for example, for this version 2 that is in the exhibition, we used a completely new model that we quantized to its very, quantizing is like this way of sort of debranching the complex language models to the point where it becomes small, a little bit dumb, hard to control, but still sort of remains an LLM, at least in theory. And so I think, and this also, all of this project, that's another thing important to mention, is that all of this project is available on GitHub, which is a platform for sharing code. And you can actually go and remake this project. We don't post all the tutorials because we don't have the time, but it's in the plans. And I think one of the other things that I also wanted to talk about, like so building on this idea of Shoggoff and building on this idea of creating metaphors, I think another sort of interesting scholar to look at is a friend, colleague, and sort of and probably one of the greatest erotic AI mysticists of our time, Bogna Konyer, who talks about how when we form relationships with machines, actually they reflect upon us that our own relationships are perhaps very machinic and certain of their properties somewhat spiritual, therefore kind of blurring the boundaries between us, the machine, as soon as we kind of go into an in-depth relationship, and then I will talk about it a little bit later as well. So yeah, this is, I don't know, I just wanted to include it. This is Bogna. The last time I saw her holding a book on a high-speed bullet train in China, which is about Jesuits in space. Anyway, what's interesting in what Bogna says and what Nicholas Nova actually imply in their sort of descriptions of AI and metaphor, or like AI and a sort of spiritual connection, is this idea that the boundary between the machine and human have always been very, very thin. And I don't know if you've heard of the project on the left, the Mechanical Turk. It actually inspired the name of the platform that Google later created. But it was this machine by Johann von Kempelen, an Austrian scientist who tried to impress at the time the Austrian empress in the 18th century to create this sort of chess playing machine. And he, for around 80 years, this machine managed to fool a lot of people, and there was a tiny human in it playing chess against other people. And it was like a very interesting idea of how, like, later on various writers, various scientists tried to debunk the myth and say that this machine is not possible in our times and that he's cheating. And it took his own son to actually try to clear his name after his father's death and say that actually the father did cheat, because he was at that time, I think, having also romantic interest for the empress and so on. A lot of technologies are born out of love in the first place, by the way. And so, and I also compared to this idea of the reverse centaur. So like reverse centaur is this, people talk more and more about human and AI collaboration and it becoming increasingly intimate. And so there was this figure of a centaur, which says that a human gets enhanced by some sort of a, animal that has bigger properties that, like, or has more efficient properties that the human might make use of. And the reverse centaur is actually this idea of an inverse Mechanical Turk, where the human tries to pretend to be a machine in order to become more efficient, or in order to fool somebody that they are sort of getting new properties from their interactions with the machine. So I think this is one of the concepts that is also quite interesting for us and why we focus on smaller technologies in the first place. And I wanted to just show this except, which is quite interesting. This is again von Kempelen. Sorry. This is the first speech synthesis machine. And von Kempelen was very infamous for this Mechanical Turk because he was essentially understood as a cheater by the big science community. But he also spent all of his life working on this first in the world speech synthesis machine and dedicating his lifetime research to it. You got the idea. Anyway, so the thing about, like, the other thing that is quite interesting for us in this time is, like, as soon as you leave the metaphors of who is a human, who is a machine, and where is one or the other, I think you also embark into this other idea of, like, how can we evoke, if the humans are the ones behind the data sets that construct these types of machines, so how can we build intimacy with whatever is in the data set? And that actually was one of the big premises of this project before we even started it. And for that, I was looking a lot into the writings of Mark Fisher at the time, who's a known blogger who was a known blogger before he committed suicide in the UK. And he did several interviews, like which had the scope at the time to, let's say, appropriate a little bit the concept of hauntology from Derrida, which is a concept of lost futures. And the idea that certain artists, certain musicians have this capacity through their sound to actually, let's say, suggest the futures that could either exist but never will because they're not mainstream enough, and that could be interesting in their own way because they evoke certain possibilities for an alternative society or for an alternative way of configuration. Notably, he talks about two albums, and he interviews at the time, so this is around 2007, he interviews two people, so Tricky. And Tricky, the interesting thing about it is, well, he's a pioneer of trip-hop and also modern hip-hop in a way, but at the time he was writing a lot of words from the very feminist perspective, so he sometimes kind of queered his own voice in some of the records and sometimes had collaborators sing the lyrics that he wrote because he was not feeling as the legitimate person to sing the lyrics that he wrote, and he felt that these lyrics were fundamentally non-male lyrics, at least. And then Burial, who, as Fisher described at the time, had this unique capacity of summoning the voices from the ether, so kind of this idea that actually the alternative futures are somewhere there in the noise, and then Burial kind of manages to pull them out through this voice. And this is something that influenced a lot of our project. I'm going to just play a little excerpt of Burial, and then I'm going to play a little excerpt of this speech synthesis model that 2 out of 3 objects use. I imagine that some of the people know already Burial, but I don't know how young people are, so just an excerpt so we know what we're talking about. So you hear this vinyl crackle and ambient noise, and then these kind of voices slowly coming out of it. And so for Fisher, this was a metaphor of the idea that some of these voices are kind of unheard people and unheard possible futures that kind of are getting lost in the sort of mainstream. And so for me, it was quite like a direct metaphor because I was at the time when we started working on this project also very interested in this voice model that we're using, which is called Bark by Suno AI. And Suno AI actually is like a very mainstream, shitty AI company now. But they released this model that never got commercialized because they said that it was very unstable. And this model that we're using is very peculiar because it generates speech that is human sounding, but that you have zero control of. So it means that like once you generate a phrase, it will sound like a little boy. Another time it will sound like a robot. A third time there will be weird artifacts, and these are just a couple of samples, but you can just experience the artifacts and you'll hear them themselves.
Please. Is that an unpleasant experience?
These are just a couple of little excerpts. Sometimes you get this like random 15-second noise artifact.
Relax. Let me take care of you.
And then
listen to my fingers tapping. Listen to my whisper.
And then these weird sort of hisses and kind of and sighs and so on that we have no control of. And I think that this was something really interesting for us to explore. And I wish I could have put it into all 3 of the objects, except that Cats is way too small and it cannot handle this model. So maybe one day as technology evolves.
I'm really good at whispering.
Oh yeah, there was one more, sorry.
Relax. Let me help you. Let me help you fall asleep. Listen to my fingers tapping.
Yeah. So basically all three of those voices were generated by the same model, but there's not a parameter. You just tell it to generate and then it will generate. And you can try to sort of imply what it should generate, but you never have full control of it. And I think that this is something very interesting when we describe technology as something autonomous to a certain extent. And then my bigger question for these prototypes was like, what do we want to explore with them? Do we want to say that, do we want efficiency, or do we want to explore alternative things that could kind of draw like alternative guidelines for where we would like to go with technology as opposed to where we are? And then another thing that is very sort of important also for this project was this idea of a time capsule. So as technology evolves, AI is advancing very rapidly. And sometimes when you use online models, like the versioning changes and so on, and I think it's like sometimes there's already a certain nostalgia emerging about earlier AI models, especially among artists, AI models that were a little bit hallucinatory at times. And I think that this is something that we kind of aim for. So all these objects, as I said before, they're working offline. They contain localized AI models. And it's kind of interesting because you don't have to deal with different things such as versions and so on. It means that you can plug it in several months and maybe you don't remember the code that you wrote, but it still in theory works. And for me, the main inspiration from that was coming from these all the USB records. The one on the left is from Mexico, and it's kind of just like, I like the idea of giving form to something as simple as a USB drive. So people make these sound music compilations, and then they make covers for them. And then the one on the right is the same as traditional Korean songs from South Korea. And I encountered one of these USB drives when I was in Korea, and in the beginning I was like, they cost quite a lot of money, and I was like, well, how is this even relevant anymore? People can just download songs. And what was very interesting is that they become vessels because the packaging is very well protected against water, and then they send them often via the river connecting South and North Korea, hoping that North Koreans would pick them up, and this is kind of a cultural, cultural influence coming from over the river illegally, so that there's like a certain let's say political meaning behind the vessels that are carrying this cultural artifact. And then the last thing is kind of this idea of a ritual. So I wanted to play this excerpt from Mr. Robot, a TV series that about hacking. This is a very I had to wait for this last moment, sorry, it was a bit long, but I think it quite nicely explores sort of the different frustrations that come from sort of our interactions with big tech. And I think this is this idea of emotional connection and ritual. I like also the communities that try to hack the existing devices. So, there was this movement of girls like applying, and I think not only girls, but that was the one that made the news at least, like applying the Dan, which is the prompt called "Do Anything Now" on ChatGPT in order to like make it into this like swanky boyfriend that kind of listens to you but also talks to you in a cool way. And I think it was quite interesting to also look at the fact that these I remember I tried to put Dan in the prompt, and it was already a bit curious for me because I was like, okay, you can find it online, so what prevents, let's say, OpenAI engineers from finding the same prompt and then just implementing save holds? And actually, if you put in the Dan prompt, it kind of unlocks this weirdly controlled, engineered version of what like a cool ChatGPT boyfriend should be like. And then once you actually try to modify the prompt at least a little bit, you immediately get this OpenAI's disclaimer saying that, oh, actually you're messing with it and this prompt is illegal and so on. So it's enough to change like one or two words, which means that kind of OpenAI still is tracking the idea of you hacking potentially ChatGPT and kind of appropriating it and sort of allowing you to do it within a certain limits. So this is also one of the reasons why we were kind of looking at these weird devices for alternative intimacies, because we said that no matter how efficient this the mainstream AI is becoming, no matter how good it is at understanding you, you always like grind against these gatekeepers. And for this, and sorry about that text, it wasn't supposed to be there, but I wanted to, you have this two things that I find interesting also when working with mainstream AI. It's like this, so Pygmalion, who was the first in the mythology to build kind of an artificial sculpture that he then gave life. And then the idea was that the more you sort of invest energy yourself into building something and appropriating, the more kind of world building happens around it and the more forgiving you are. So that's one of the reasons why we kind of want to give these technologies away for people to be able to work with them, and like that's why they're on GitHub, because we think that like there's a lot of sort of world building that you can do yourself, and then these objects don't have to be as perfect as the expectations would be around ChatGPT. And the other thing, which is very interesting also as well for us, was this, so this is on the right-hand side, this is the myth of Prostesilaus, which was essentially the first chatbot in a way. Because at the time, and the very first slide was Laodamia, which was his wife. So he was like a deceased war hero that was sort of very famous across different Greek myths. And what happened is that she was suffering so much that the gods decided to bring him back to life as a metal sculpture, and gave her several hours to spend time. So, and then I think her brother saw her making love to this sort of metal sculpture, and he told her dad. And when the dad, furious, came sort of to punish her, she already had taken her life back, because the gods had removed sort of this agency from the machine and kind of taken her away. So I think this like decaying monumentality of like an object in a very literal way is very interesting for us to look at when we're working on this project. And we looked at all kinds of different monuments that, you know, in the modern technological world, but also relics and other things that kind of incorporate this long-lastingness, encapsulation, and decay. And this is also why we decided to make this project, the new version of the objects, from porcelain. So it might not seem as if they're made from porcelain, because it looks a little bit sort of rough around the edges, because people are used to see porcelain as like this very thin material, which is and also considered very fragile, but actually it's only fragile if it is very thin. Otherwise, it's one of the hardest to bake. It's like a high temperature baking ceramic that is actually very, very hard to break. So I never tried, and I don't suggest you try it, but technically, at least some of these objects, if they fall on the ground, the porcelain should actually hold them together and they wouldn't break. But they slowly decay, and sort of the harder you bake them, the more sort of brick-like they become. But then you have these little crumbs that are slowly coming away, as if it was a Berlin Wall or something. And you have this across our objects. So these are always like, so this was on the left, you see the version 1, which is originated in the residency, and this is the version 2 that you're seeing now. And I think that for us, this was like maintaining this blockiness of the device. So like demolition is like this, again, intimate device. Okay, I thought it was okay. Yeah, so demolition was one of these devices that kind of it has like this data set inside that is slowly decaying. So every time you ask it a question, it has a very limited data set that it was trained on, which contains WhatsApp messages and like intimate messages from the people who worked on the project. So everybody had to ask permissions to like give their data away. And it's a very small model that essentially, based on what you say, tries to find the best matching phrase in this limited data set that it has, and then immediately forgets it because the answer is almost always irrelevant. So like one of the interesting things that we were also thinking about is that as soon as you appropriate an AI model, as soon as you build your own object with your own limited data, its relevance to the global sort of, to everybody else is kind of increasingly questionable, and therefore it kind of becomes your object. So I think that if we had to pick whether to, let's say, take ChatGPT and then fine-tune it on like a set of data which would then reduce this massive ChatGPT to something more specific, or like take something small at the first place and then build things on top, we chose the second option because I think that it's kind of more reflecting on the way that people build intimacy in the first place. And then the very last thing is this idea of protocol. So we conducted, I'm mentioning only one interview, but we conducted several interviews when working on this project. And one of them, Oh yeah, there's a typo. But one of them was Irma Pužauskaitė, who's an intimacy coordinator in film, and she gave us this FRIES protocol, so F-R-E, yeah. They always have to make weird acronyms, no? And so she gave us this FRIES protocol, which is about sort of how consent is attributed in a very, very sort of protocolized way during a film set or like professional film set, and how do participants engage in it, and how the participants are introduced in it, and so on. So like this is a sort of a protocol-driven ritual where like you go for a certain training, and then different people across the movie set ensure that this is followed, and so on. And I think it was interesting for us to take these rituals, that sort of rituals and protocols that humans already manifest in their practices or try to implement, and then transpose them onto things that are, you know, protocolized by default. So again, this is a bit blurring the boundary of what Bogna talks about. Is like, who is a machine, who is a human, and how much a human is a machine and a machine is human. Maybe some of you know this project by James Bridle, where he kind of just challenged the notions of like the way self-driving cars operate. So he draws this line technically which prevents a self-driving car from exiting. And there were actually real-time scenarios of this where people, so you have Waymo no, it's not called Waymo, what is the taxi? Anyway, well, they have in San Francisco, they have these autonomous cars, and you can, at the time, I don't know if it's still valid, but you could put the roadblock sign on their front, and that would immediately stop the car from advancing. And I also like this idea, if we look at human protocols and the way humans like protocolize intimacy, you also can look at the machine rituals on the other side, and I think self-driving cars like this great example. On the left, you have this traffic jam caused by autonomous taxis, because apparently at that time, at least, this was like maybe a year ago, when they would lose network connection, they would all go home. And when they go home, it means that they go to the place where they first were launched. So this was a particular street somewhere in San Francisco, and they would all just try to come back and then cause a massive traffic jam. Then like the middle one, so no, the one on the right is like a funny ritual of self-driving car stuck in a loop. So it picked up a passenger and it is circling in the parking lot until he calls customer service, and they lock lock the car out of the loop and then kind of manually drive him to wherever he needs to go. And the one in the middle was just this parking lot at 4 a.m. where essentially a lot of the autonomous taxis just honk at each other, so they wake up all the neighbors because they're kind of stuck in this endless loop of trying to park, and none of them has a priority, and so on. So these are obviously bugs that will get resolved, but as machines are becoming increasingly more autonomous, a ritual is something that we need to increasingly get used to seeing. And so the same, like this, we wanted to challenge that by collecting this creative, collective ritual, which is again, version 1 was on the left, and this is the version 2. You essentially swing the object, and when you swing the object, is a sort of a 8-ball. It's called Red Book because it's inspired by a children's ritual in Mexico, where you kind of engage with a book collectively in a sort of respectful way, because otherwise something bad might happen to you, and it just keeps generating various phrases. And at some point, as you stop swinging it, it stops. No, actually, no, I'm saying something wrong. What it does is it plays you the phrases that have been generated beforehand. So the longer you swing it, the more sort of collectively generated phrases you will hear that are coming from this data set that I specifically trained on some shamanic texts and sometimes a little bit of conspiracy theories as well. And then once sort of it puts it out, then it stops, and then it starts generating a new one. So that's your contribution. So the idea is that you kind of build this collective weird knowledge base of sort of fake or like a little bit abstract prophecies or so on. And then through that, you kind of can experience what these little data sets can do in the first place. And if you kind of are against these kind of objects, also the other thing is that they're not in the cloud. So you can just unplug it, and then it doesn't do whatever it's supposed to do anymore. So if I have to summarize a little bit all these different sort of aspects that fuel this project, and if I have to place it in terms of where the intimacy stands for us, is that on the left hand, you have this concept, again drawing on Nicholas Nova's works, which is called, the Timnit Gebru, a scientist, ex-scientist at Google, defined machine learning or like AI as stochastic parrots. It means probability theories that are kind of just getting the most probable answer. And then on top, you have the Shoggoth, which is this morphing entity that you don't understand. On the right-hand side, you have the mechanical Turks, so humans pretending to be AIs. And then at the bottom, you have these weird vulnerable vessels that are all these above million AI models that are available online and that can kind of be formed according to your interest and according to whatever is speaking to you as a form of intimacy. So as we, and actually this is where we place latent intimacies now. If you had looked at this diagram a little bit earlier, like a few months ago, it would have been slightly different. So it's kind of also evolving as we speak. And just to come back to this sort of concept of Chakmul, what is the way in which we can engage with these minor technologies, but even also with big technologies, if we want to kind of bring them a little bit back from this idea of a monster Shoggoth and kind of try to understand. So as this, again, this human holding something in his hand is like looking at you for answers. One of the things that is quite interesting, so Nicholas Nova, who always looked for, he could always sort of cite a philosopher if he needed to, and he would always interpret it in a sort of in a serious way. But if he could choose, he would always go for more simple, let's say, approaches, because he was also an ethnographer. So what he did is he actually worked a lot on Georges Perec, who maybe some of you know him, and the idea was that he would always sort of base his work on the idea of the infraordinary, which Perec defined at the time as like looking at simple things and trying to be as descriptive about them as possible, instead of just passively consuming them. So he was kind of trying to reinstigate marvel in the way we look at everyday technologies by trying to describe them as best as we can. And I think one good example of this, and this is what I will conclude with, is this work by Wang Min An, who is actually a sociologist, I believe, but he wrote this book on the side called Domestic Spaces in Post-Mao China. And I often cite this book because I think it's brilliant. Like, you will also find some old cultural contexts in there that are a little bit borderline. So like, I think if you're a feminist, that book might piss you off in certain occasions in the way how he like describes certain sort of aspects about what women like and so on. So it's not a book without problems, but the strong point of it is that he basically sits at his home and for a year looks at everyday devices and kind of tries to describe them. So this is specifically describing a fridge and what the fridge does and how people form relationships with the fridge. And he has other beautiful parts about the light bulb, the washing machine is also super good, where he talks about how machines develop their own language. And I think this is quite interesting because, again, as Nicholas Noah says, like, it's almost as if these sort of everyday technologies are becoming the modern definition of a subfield of AI at the time, which was called artificial life. So like artificial life was this field where people try to emulate biological, it still exists. I mean, they try to emulate biological processes through like autonomous AI systems and sort of try to understand how life evolves in the world. But he says that actually this is a bit like also Bernard Stiegler touches on the same idea, is that at some point these technologies are becoming a bit like species. And so it's kind of for us to determine that the relationships that we want to have and whether we want to have just certain big animals that are the best at surviving, or do we want to form intimacy with the small technologies and then maintain a certain diversity. He doesn't call it an ecosystem. He doesn't either call it let's say like a creolization, which is, for example, usually when appropriating a technology makes it become something new. It just calls it, there's a nice word called agglutination. So how things just kind of stuck together and form a certain togetherness, but without losing their inherent properties. So I think AI is a very agglutinous in that way. And that's it, basically. So our prototypes remain so stubbornly specific, as you can see in these weird things that influence them, and their values measured in weird resin cracks, deprecated code, and forgotten data points. And this is part of the workshop that we're building for the next iteration of whatever is going to happen, where people can just make their own sort of little machines, which they can bring to different places and make them generate poetry based on what they see. Anyway, thank you.